Hi everyone, this is my run on RCL's Lost Chapter, Swordmaiden Part 15, and this is also my 7th Vincent non-synergy showcase, and it's a pretty straightforward fight with this party composition. And before going to the fight, I just want to quickly cover the setup because it is quite important. The biggest difficulty in this fight is actually handling the Lufenia Orb, which requires you to dispel the enemy's buffs. And the fight can be a little bit RNG dependent because not every attack the bosses have will grant themselves buffs. So there are some runs where you could find yourself in a situation where the Lufenia Orb is about to tick down and you don't actually have any buffs to dispel, thereby ending the run. There is no auto buff scenario in this fight, which means that the only way the bosses can get buffs is to actually allow them to get actions. The other annoying thing about this fight is the fact that they have an attack called Gluttony Sickle, and the game actually tells you in advance when they are about to use this attack because it will give you a prompt saying that the mantis is starving and there will be a greyish aura surrounding the mantis. Now, Gluttony Sickle itself isn't too bad because it's just a standard AoE brave into HP attack. The annoying thing about it is that it dispels all your buffs, including framed buffs. So characters who are very reliant on buffs, I think one good example would be Ramza, I will find a tougher time in this fight. So which brings me to the party composition here. So first of all, I have here the combo of Balthier and Penelo, and it's actually quite a good combo for this fight. So first of all, Balthier acts as the party dispeller, and he can actually control how many buffs he wants to dispel. If you use his snatch shot, it dispels one buff at a time, whereas if you use his EX, is also one buff at a time, and then his great aim and his LD skill removes 3 buffs at once. So there could be situations where you want to remove more buffs, and there could be situations where you only want to remove 1 buff at a time, and I'll go more into that during the fight. Penelo I use in this fight for a few reasons. Firstly, she gives enough HP regen to sustain all the HP damage in the fight, but very importantly, she can also cleanse your team with her LD. Although really it's not really needed, the fluke debuffs that the bosses use aren't very damaging and they only last for 3 turns, so you can just spam instant turn skills to remove the fluke debuffs. However, the biggest benefit I think using Penelo here is that her LD grants the entire party instant buffs, and her S1 Haste Roomba is also an instant skill. What this means is that both Penelo and Balthier can ramp up very quickly, so in the event that all their buffs gets dispelled, all they need to do is use Balthier's LD to bring himself to full speed, and then for Penelo to use her LD to grant the entire party the rest of her buffs, and she can even do Haste Roomba into her LD to complete her buffs in 1 turn. So therefore, getting dispelled by the bosses isn't too difficult to manage in this fight, and they don't use Gluttony Sickle that often anyway, so just having Penelo and Balthier's LD is more than enough to handle the dispels. The third party member I use is Vincent. Of course, it being his showcase, that's why I put him in the 3rd slot, but he does bring some utility in this fight as well. So first of all, he carries a very strong defense down debuff, which combined with the auras from both Penelo and Balthier allows you to hit for maximum damage with your entire party for the entire fight. Next, and also quite importantly, Vincent can debuff attack down, and it comes very handy in some of the turns the bosses have For example, Gluttony Sickle itself is based on the boss's attack stat. So if you debuff their attack right before they use Gluttony Sickle, it deals very pitiful damage to your entire party. The other thing about Vincent is that he of course brings strong DPS to the fight as well. Although I guess for the third party member any DPS will do, it's nice having his attack and defense down to supplement Balthier and Penelo in this fight, as you will see later on. Now the calls is actually very important if you're using Vincent, and the order that I set them in is actually quite important. After some play testing, I think this is the best way to set the calls. So first of all, Balthier has a root call, and that's really for him to use the call right at the start of the fight to trigger Odin's blessing, so that the entire party gets an additional 30% attack up. Secondly, Hope and Jack calls are mainly actually for their frame debuffs that they do, and the reason for this is that of this entire party there's only one frame debuff, and that comes from Vincent's EX. And having Hope and Jack and using them one by one allows me to have 2 frame debuffs up on the bosses at all times. And this allows Vincent to always have his follow-up attack triggered whenever he attacks the bosses. Without 2 frame debuffs, what happens is the bosses will frequently buff themselves with sometimes 4 or 5 buffs, and this will push off every single non-framed debuff that Vincent has on the boss, so which will actually significantly cut Vincent's DPS. So therefore having both Hope and Jack's LD call comes in very useful in this fight. Lastly, for the friend support unit, I use Ramza with Burst, and that completes the non-synergy team setup for this fight. With this party, it is pretty straightforward, and for most part of the fight, you can comfortably just tank all the attacks the bosses throw at you and heal back up with Penelo's Aura's healing regen after that. The only thing that may end the run is bad RNG where the bosses don't grant themselves enough buffs. However, that shouldn't happen too often, and as long as you control how many buffs you dispel with Balthier, you should have more than enough buffs to last for the rest of the fight. So that's it for the setup. I will also put in the video description a timestamp, so you can use that to skip ahead to the section that you are interested in. And I will also be including in the timestamp a more detailed setup of my party, which includes the artifact passives and the spheres equipped, so you can check that out if you are interested in those. So that's it. With that said, let's move into the battle. Now the start of the fight is all about proper setup. However, there is one important thing to note, that the Mantis will use Gluttony Sickle very early on in the fight. I think it's on its third attack, second or third attack if I'm not mistaken. So with that said, I actually don't use Balthier's LD straight away. I prefer to save it as a way to quickly ramp up after getting dispelled. So at the start of the fight, I burn all of Balthier's AA ability, as well as I use Root Call, and the aim is to bring Balthier's overhead to 5 stacks as fast as possible. You can choose to save Balthier's AA to gravity shave the bosses when they battery themselves later in the fight. However, I find that with this party it's not really needed, just because Vincent alone will be able to shave off all the brave by himself due to his insane damage. So with Vincent, I always use his first turn inflicting his attack down debuff. This allows me to tank the first 2 attacks that the bosses do. With Penelo, likewise, I also hold off on using her LD, And again, that's really because the bosses will soon use Gluttony Sickle to cleanse all your debuffs, to dispel the entire party anyway. So there's no point using her LD too early in the game. And I just use her 2 skills followed by an HP attack to quickly charge her EX. Alright, here you see the prompt that the Mantis is starving, and Mantis B has the grey aura, which is a signal that it's about to use Gluttony Sickle. And the next few turns is really all about just preparing for the attack. So, for example, if it's possible, you really want to try to get Penelo to move right before the boss, so that she can battery the entire party before Gluttony Sickle. Even without that, it's not too bad because Root Call at the start of the fight has given you additional HP, and you should be able to tank the Gluttony Sickle regardless of how much damage it does. It's also helpful if you can land an attack down debuff on the boss, which will neuter the damage Gluttony Sickle does. Okay, so to recover from the mass dispel from Gluttony Sickle, with Penelo you want to go Haste Roomba into LD. You can of course use her EX if it's charged, since her EX is an instant turn ability. But as long as you go Haste Roomba first and then LD after, it completes the buffs. And very nicely, her LD also cleanses the Fluke debuff from your entire party. With Vincent, he doesn't really need many buffs, so just using either his first or second skill will actually complete his ramp up. So he's also pretty easy to ramp up to full in this fight. So with Balthier, he loses his 3 stacks of his framed buff, and that's why I save his LD. So his LD really counters the dispel from Gluttony Sickle, and using it will remove 3 buffs from both bosses, as well as give him full 3 stacks. So just by each character taking 1 turn each, I fully recover from Gluttony Sickle. This is why I think this is really a great party to bring to this fight. Okay, unfortunately, the bosses also displaced all of Vincent's generic debuffs, and because I want there to be 2 debuffs on the bosses, what I do is use Hope's LD Call to inflict 1 frame debuff. So that combined with his Nightmare debuff from his EX is enough to trigger his follow-up attacks. Okay, so now that the orbs are out, you want to manage the buff cleansing very carefully with Balthier. Ideally, you only want to dispel the buffs when the orb is at 10 count or so, because each time a buff is dispelled, it increases the orb by 10, and the max count is only 20. So you really have to choose the right skill to fit the situation. For example, I use Grid Aim there because it's only a single target cleanse, and I'm actually saving the buff on the other mantis for when the orb count is slightly lower. Okay, so this is an example of slightly bad RNG. So Mantis A took a turn, but it didn't use an attack that granted itself a buff. So I'm now in a situation where Mantis A's Lufenia Orb only has 11 count left, and I don't have any buff to dispel. At this point, you want to be very careful in turn order, especially with instant turn characters like Penelo, because if she takes too many instant turns back to back, the Lufenia Orb will continue ticking down, and you need to leave yourself enough room for Balthier to get a turn to dispel the orb. So the orb for Mantis A is now only at 4 count, and I need to manage this very carefully because if Mantis A takes a turn, the orb will expire and will explode. And what I'm trying to do here is actually delay the bosses each by 1 turn, so that Balthier can get a turn and dispel Mantis A right before the orb expires. Unfortunately, Penelo doesn't really have any good breath shaving skills, so that's where I use Ninja Slice from Jack to push back Mantis B. And then with Penelo here, I decided to use her LD, and that's because using either her S1 or S2 will push up her turn order before Balthier, and that will end the run. So by doing that, I manipulate the turns so that Balthier will be able to get his turn just on time to increase the orb counter. But with Vincent, you do want to be very careful because sometimes using his skills will result in him getting an instant turn right after. So that's why I looked at his turn order before I used his skill. Now here I was planning to bring in Ramza by swapping out Penelo, and I was actually planning to use Jack's LD core before I bring in Ramza. Unfortunately though, the bosses buffed themselves, so boss A now has a full buff slot, which means Jack's LD call wouldn't land on Mantis A. So because of that, I decided to save Jack's LD call for later in the fight. And I decided to just swap in Ramza here. On hindsight, I think it's probably way better to wait until the bosses are closer to 40% before bringing in Ramza. However, I didn't want to wait too long because I wanted to get the full effect from Ramza's burst. So before bringing Ramza, I decided to go all out with Penelo to get a little bit of damage in without worrying too much about the orb, and that's because I'm about to actually use my summon. So inside summon, I will be very easily increasing the orb count anyway. Okay, so this is where I decided to pop my summon. I wanted to use Ramza's LD, but I realized Mantis A is launchable, so I decided to use Ramza's Enervate first, just to get some nice launch damage in. So the goal, as far as possible, is to try to kill both bosses in the same turn, because when one dies, the other will heal itself for 10% of its HP and will gain additional stat boosts. It isn't too bad. The only thing is that this fight has a 75 turn count, so if you're quite close to the turn count, letting the boss heal by 10% can actually be a run ender. So on hindsight, looking at this, I think it's probably better to bring in Ramza when the bosses are roughly at about 40% or so, and that will allow you to deplete most of the 40% while Ramza is in play. Alright, so Penelo is back into play, and I really want to try to see whether I can kill off the bosses together. This party does lack a little bit of AoE, but you can actually make do because Balthier and Penelo's LD are both AoE attacks, and Balthier's EX also does nice damage as well. So here I contemplated waiting a little bit because Mantis A still has 3% health. However, I decided to just bite the bullet and see whether Vincent could finish off Mantis A with his follow-up attack. So unfortunately, I came pretty close, but the Mantis hang on with, I guess, roughly 1% health remaining, and unfortunately healed itself for a full 10% health. So a little bit of miscalculation on my part, and because of that, I had to take additional turns to end the fight. Otherwise, I could have ended within 59 or 60 turns. However, you know, if you have turns to spare, having one Mantis Enrage isn't really too bad. You just need to take the additional 4 or 5 turns to deplete the last 10% health again. Alright, so that's it. In total, I ended on turn 66, so it looks like I had to take an additional 6 turns to deplete the additional 10% HP healing the boss's head. But I guess you know, it's still quite a comfortable win, considering that you are given 75 turns to complete, and I didn't use any burst mode in my main party. So as always, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, do leave a like, comment or subscribe. It really helps a lot. Till then, I'll see you in the next Lufenia fight. Bye bye.